Well, welcome everybody to our Rectors Forum. We're so glad that you've joined us this morning for this conversation. I'm going to begin with a prayer. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Gracious and loving God, we give thanks for this opportunity to learn about the people of Christ Church, Martinsville, and critical transformative events that took place in the 50s there. We ask that you open our hearts and minds this morning to be inspired by these events and to reflect on our own context and the ways in which we are called to be disciples of Jesus Christ. All this we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Well, Roy, it is a pleasure to have you with us. Our guest this morning is Roy Pollina. He is a retired Episcopal priest. Enjoying retirement, no doubt?
Absolutely.
Right. And you're living in North Georgia now, is that right?
Right outside Chattanooga. Right outside.
But Roy, for many years, was the rector of Christ Church in Martinsville, Christ Episcopal Church in Martinsville. And he has a story to share with us this morning that I hope will spark some creative discussion in this group. So Roy, some pretty amazing things happened at Christ Church in the 1950s with a pioneering bishop in many ways, a sort of, it almost sounds stereotypical, but the young prophetic rector coming in at 29, right? Young people in some ways leading the way. What happened in the 1950s? I know you've got some slides here that you can share with us. So walk us through, what's the basic story?
Well, how many of you have been to Martinsville? Let me ask that first. Okay. Martinsville, when I moved there, was somewhat on its heels because of it. But at the time we're talking, it was a very, very prominent, wealthy town.
Big manufacturing.
Big manufacturing. It was a place to be. People could make money there, both white and black. As a matter of fact, I understand many of the. I interviewed one African American man who told me that there were two towns that you went to in the 50s if you were coming off of your hardscrabble farm life, trying to find your way. You went to Richmond or Martinsville. Those were the two places African Americans could make some money and prosper within the confines of Jim Crow. The quote you see at the top: the official policy of the diocese at such meetings is to make no distinction because of race or color. That is a quote that Bishop William Marmion gave at his very first diocesan council. Bishop Marmion was consecrated bishop in 1954. 4 days after his consecration, the Supreme Court handed down the judgment on Brown versus Board of Education. So that became an issue. At the vestry meeting in 1958, despite Bishop Marmion saying that in 1954, they were surprised that the youth camp at Hemlock Haven was going to be integrated. One of the first things Bishop Marmion did was to get a camp because there was no place where his diocese could meet together, black and white. There was no hotel they could stay at, no restaurant they could eat in. So he wanted a camp and conference center so that they could all meet together. They got Hemlock Haven, and the vestry was kind of surprised. Okay, the next slide is what? The vestry in Martinsville was upset, and they had a somewhat contentious meeting. There is Phil Gresham, 29. He was a wrestler in college. He was smart. He was good looking. He was short. The kids loved him because he was eye level with them. He stood on a coat crate in the pulpit so that they could see him. He was single. He went home, and he he wrote to his bishop. He needed to talk to somebody about this issue that had come up in his parish. And he wrote this, and the last two sentences are probably the key. Despite the initial anger, great wisdom in their thinking has come out. Some mighty fine Christians are segregationists. Somewhat cringeworthy, but let me say this about Phil, and if you read the book, I think you'll agree with me. This was his first cure as a priest in charge. This was the first time he was rector. He was 29 years old. When you read about him, you will see that he has a pastor's heart. God had given him a church that was populated, the leadership at least was populated with segregationists. How do you faithfully carry out your ministry as pastor and priest in those kinds of situations? Okay. This is the response. I should point out this is the resolution that they sent to the bishop and the vestry's thinking about integration of the Camp and Conference Center. I should point out that there are several lawyers on the vestry, including the senior warden, who is a Supreme Court justice for the Commonwealth, as was his father. So here's what they write, and this will give you a feeling of the deep-seated understanding of integration and segregation in those times, and what the vestry viewed as the good social order. They do not think they're racists. They think they are protecting the good social order of Virginia. The integrated meeting of the youth is both illegal and ill-advised. The history of the Episcopal Church is segregation. The laws of this sovereign commonwealth expressly forbid the intermingling of races. Next slide. Therefore, be it resolved, the vestry heartily disapproves of the contemplated integrated youth meeting, our understanding being that there will be no intimate associations permitted between the children of two races. We feel that the above is in keeping with Christian reasoning, and the intermingling of the races, in addition to being illegal, can and are only lead to bitterness, discord, confusion among our people. The good order of society must be protected. Martinsville made the news. The Episcopal Church regularly made the news. Okay? Let's see, we're going to 17. Prior to the council in 1958, the executive board gets together and the chancellor offers his resignation to the bishop. He is the chancellor of the diocese, the only chancellor that the diocese has ever had. Diocese was founded in 1919. He's still there in 1958, and he resigns because he thinks that the bishop is wrong in his desire to. They vote. And we have any delegates to convention? Yes, okay. You know, most votes are taken. You say all in favor, say aye, and everybody says aye. You go on. There is, in the canons of most dioceses, including Southwestern Virginia, where you can vote by orders. The lay people and the clergy vote separately, and kind of like the House of Representatives and the Senate of the United States government, both houses have to carry an order in order for something to pass. Almost everything having to do with Hemlock Haven is a vote by orders, because the clergy and the lay people are very split. So here's some of the proposals. Let's have a white camp and a black camp. Segregation, that doesn't pass. Let's have a white camp and an integrated plan. White kids can go by themselves, and if you want your white kids to go with white kids, that's fine. But we're going to have two camps: integrated by race, segregated by gender. the black boys and the white boys can play together, the black girls and the white girls can play together, but there's not going to be any gender mixing at camp. And then the one that actually passes no camp this year. (1959). One of the things that they decided to do in 1958 was to have a committee that would visit every parish in the diocese and find out what the people wanted to do. They come back with 2 reports, 1 for, 1 against. The lay clergy divide continues. The lay clergy divide continues. The clergy insists that voting against integration is a repudiation of church doctrine. The lay delegates claim that integration segregation is a matter of policy. This becomes a real issue, and who gets to decide about integration? Is this a moral theological problem in which the clergy should take the lead, and the bishop, being the chief ecclesiastical authority in the diocese, should be able to make that decision himself? He's the bishop. If this is a religious question, he gets to decide. If it's a matter of policy, then the lay people should get a voice. The consul is the policy-making division in the diocese. That becomes a real issue. What happens? No camp again this year. By 1960, things are just going from bad to worse. Back in Martinsville, let me talk about, everybody knows what UTO offering, the little blue box, that type of thing. They had a white box for the children. And for Lent, they would fill it with their nickels, dimes, and quarters, and then at the end of Lent, they would all go to a church, usually St. John's in Roanoke. They would hand in their boxes, they would have a meal, and they would all go home. This was a card that was sent to the parishioners, the parents of the children in Martinsville. Please remember to bring box suppers. Beverages will be provided. Next. You can read it for yourself, but this is a letter. This is the minutes of the Christ Vestry meeting. One of the parents went to a meeting in the diocese and found out that both the black and the white churches were invited to this mite box service and lunch. When I reached home that Sunday, my wife handed me the enclosed card, the one I just showed you. Of particular interest to my 2 children, Molly and Roberta, both members of our church. The enclosed card does not indicate that Molly and Roberta are being urged to attend a Negro white social. It's a box lunch for kids. I do not care to have my children urged to attend anything that the rector of our church must know that I, as a father, am deeply opposed to, and I petition you, gentlemen, to make such action. Protect me and all members of our church from such deception in the future. The result of that meeting, before I get to the epilogue, the result of that vestry meeting is at the end of the vestry meeting, Phil Gresham resigns. The vestry had said that 2 things would happen. The vestry said, turned to the secretary of the vestry and said, we want you to send another card warning the parents that their children might eat lunch with black children. The fact that they turned to the secretary of the vestry rather than ask the priest to ask his secretary to do it shows that they bought into that deception that the priest was being accused of. They also instructed the priest that from now on, any meeting that he invites members of the congregation to, he has to tell them ahead of time whether it will be whites only or not. I get a little rubber stamp that says, not for whites only or whites only. That was too far for Gresham. He just couldn't do that. So he resigned. There were several contentious meetings. At one point, the diocesan council ended without a budget. The lay people, the lay delegates refused to fund Hemlock Haven at all if it was going to be integrated. They took it. So they just decided not to vote for any budget at all for the diocese. Finally, in 1962, they have a special council, and they have to solve it, or the diocese is just going to close up. 6 racial integrated camps, 3 for boys, 3 for girls. Separation by gender continued into the 1970s. There was always an undertone of sexuality in the racial situation. Remember, this is the time of To Kill a Mockingbird and those types of stories. Ultimately, Hemlock Haven is sold in 1985. And then in 1983, at a diocesan convention, Francis West, who was a prominent member of Christ Church in Martinsville, was one of the leaders in segregation. He had secret letters going out to all of the churches saying, we need more people to go to council so that they can vote against it. He had a little cabal going against the bishop. And then in 1993, he gets $73,000 for a Marmion library, saying, I have long since come to the realization that there was more right on his side than on mine. So a little bit of grace there. And then finally there's this, and I have it written down here so I can read. It's hard to say that Phil Gresham ever survived this. He kind of wandered around looking for cures for a while. He wound up in Colorado, and then he was a chaplain in Sicily. He had a stroke and took an early retirement and died at the age of 27 to 85, in his 50s. There in the book, there are several letters that he wrote to Bishop Marmion. He kept correspondence with Bishop Marmion saying how much he missed Martinsville. I didn't spend a lot of time in this presentation with how popular he was with the youth. That he was a rock star to the youth. He got them a pool table. Again, Music Man had come out. He got them a jukebox. They were rocking and rolling in the basement of the church on a Sunday night. The Methodists and the Baptists had to close down some of their youth activities because their kids were all over at the Episcopal church listening to rock and roll. But in what year was this? 1986. The youth, who are now adults, hung this plaque. I also should tell you that the youth that thought Gresham was the greatest priest they'd ever met hired me. So they'd all grown up, not because I was very youthful at the time. It says, to the glory of God and loving memory of the Reverend Philip Gresham, 1927 to 1985, Rector of Christ Church, 1956 to 60. He was only there 4 years. Inspired preacher, lover of worship, teacher of youth, bold prophet. The peace of God, it is no peace, but strife closed in the sod. Yet brethren, pray for but one thing, the marvelous peace of God, given by the members of his youth group, 1986. greatest priest they ever knew. Thank you, Father.
Thank you, Roy. We'll keep this up just in case we have, I'm going to refer back to some of the other slides, but talk a little bit more about the issue of doctrine versus policy. So it appears that in the thinking in the church, there was this sort of distinction between doctrine or church teaching or theology, whatever term we want to use, that is the purview of the clergy, the bishop, the rector, and so forth, and then other stuff, we might call it secular things even, that the clergy maybe have a voice on, but really that's the area where the laity, the vestry in particular as the representatives of the laity, will make the decision. Where did that mindset come from to draw that kind of distinction? And what did the clergy say about that distinction?
There's some disassociative thinking here on Martinsville. I can talk with some authority about that church. Martinsville was a church of leaders. Their senior warden was a justice. They had mayors. They had business executives. These were men who were used to making decisions about what was good policy for their communities. And some of their communities were only Martinsville, and if you're a justice, it reaches even further. They were used to making those decisions for the community. They were also on the vestry. At one point in the vestry, I said any large corporation in Virginia would have loved to have that vestry as their board of directors. I mean, these were smart, successful men, who's only men. But they also were used to making decisions for the church too. So it was difficult for them to accept the fact that if this be a moral decision, completely immoral decision, they have to follow the lead of their clergy, and they didn't. They say over and over again, this is a social political problem. Integration is a social political problem. It has nothing to do with the church. Matter of fact, it's on one of the slides there, but the senior warden stated as such, this is a social political problem that doesn't touch religion whatsoever. Did the clergy challenge that view? Absolutely. Okay. Absolutely. What did they say? What was the argument? It was they went back to that this was a moral teaching, that there were several general conventions. There were Lambeth that all were saying that race could not separate people. It did. I mean, Sewanee, the entire faculty of Sewanee quit when they were told that they couldn't integrate the university. And over and over again, the church often looked at black people in their church as a problem to be solved. To most of the clergy, not all of the clergy, but most of the clergy, it was to their benefit, to their I can't think of the right thing, but that they saw integration as a moral problem and tried to lead the statements from the lay people was the clergy are bullying the lay people. We feel we're being bullied. And so, as you see, 5 years of conflict at a diocesan convention, ending in a convention that couldn't pass a budget.
You know, what's striking me about this story is it's sort of a case study of the very things that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. talked about in his letter from the Birmingham jail. I don't know if you ever read it, but it's worth reading if you haven't. This is precisely the divide that he questions, this notion that you can somehow have any element of life be disconnected from your spirituality, from your walk with Jesus. And, you know, it strikes me that the essence of this divide, really, of this struggle between the laity and the clergy was this notion that there were somehow two realms to life, you know. That what you do on Sunday at church is one realm, but then what you do, you know, Monday through Saturday is some completely other world that is disconnected from your Christian discipleship. And I guess my follow-up question, because, you know, part of what we're thinking about here together is, what's the relevance of this for our time? Have we transcended that divide? Or does that divide still linger in our minds? What are your thoughts, Rick?
I think of all the conversations that went about people coming across the border, whether it's an illegal invasion or the refugees, what that situation is. To what degree is the border situation simply a governmental social political problem, to use their language? From the 50s. Is it a social political problem? Countries do get to have their borders. But what do you do when they're here? Can you give them sanctuary? Can you feed them? Can you clothe them? And if you don't, what does that say about your moral? Those issues are still among us when we look at something that's still in the headlines today. What is the proper reaction for that? I lived in Louisiana when Bishop Joe Doss and Bishop Frey were still priests bringing in refugees from Haiti, and they got spit on, and those types of things. What from Cuba? Not from Cuba. We had the Haiti problem too, but they were bringing them in from Cuba, what is the proper role of the church in those kinds of situations? Yeah, it hasn't gone away.
Did you find some of those same conversations when you were at Christ Church? Was that same attitude still present in the community, or had the community been in some ways transformed in a unique way because of this experience?
Yes and no.
Okay.
Yes and no. I started to put this in the book, and then I thought, no, I'm not going to do this. But there was an incident that was talked about for a month, and then it went away. But an advanced school group. They were the smart kids. In the school had a group that went around and did things, and one of the things they did was they made a quilt, and it had patches on the quilt, and they presented it to the city council. They gave it as a gift to the city council, gave it as a gift to the city of Manville, and they were describing all of the different patches, and one of the patches was showed a outline of a silhouette of a black silhouette and a gold silhouette and a bridge in between, and they said, well, that's going from from people who are being educated, to enlightenment. So it was black crossing the bridge to go. And one of the black members of the city council questioned the children about why the person who didn't have education was black and the person who got the other said, well, it's darkness and light, that type of thing. At the end of the day, there were children who were crying being questioned about this. It was a very awkward thing. Probably could have been better handled, but we understand what the Black Councilwoman was saying. This became a very big topic of conversation. And at coffee hour, I asked my congregation, I said, you always want me to preach about things that are current and happening. I said, would you like me to put together a sermon on this? I said, no. Please, no. No, actually, one person goes, well, do you have an opinion one way or the other? And I said, well, I think I do. And they go, well, then don't. So, yes.
Well, Roy, I think it's time for us to open it up for questions. I'm sure some of you all have some questions for Roy. So what questions do you have about the story of Martinsville, or maybe even connections to our own time? Jeff,
so
yes.
All of this is talking about the potential for a youth campus in the summer, right? So what's going on in the worship? There's no integration, and did it eventually become an integrated parish with a lot of African American members?
So what's the makeup of the congregation on Sunday mornings, and is integration happening in the worship services?
In the time period we're talking about, there are black churches and white churches. In Martinsville, there were black churches and white churches. At one point, a member of Christ Church, who's a developer, offers Christ Church that was growing so fast that it didn't have room. He said, I will give you land to start a second church, a second Episcopal church in town. And they debated, the vestry debated whether they wanted to start a second Episcopal church in town, completely forgetting that there was a second Episcopal church in town. Bishop Marmion, kind of unintended consequences, wanted to break this racial barrier and close some of the black churches and invite them into the white churches. It didn't happen.
Yeah.
The African Americans went to other black churches. In some cases they were welcome, but in a lot of cases they were told.
Yeah, Jeff, this question you brought up is a really interesting one, and has surprised me a tremendous amount in my ministry here in Virginia. So one of my best friends, Ben Shelton, was the vicar of he was deacon in charge at the time of the African American church in Martinsville. But he has made this point to me, and I've seen it as well, which is that very often the attempt to integrate churches was not well received by both sides, but also by the black population that felt disempowered when they would go into white churches, that they would not be given like kind of an equal level of leadership, and so they simply left the Episcopal Church. And it's the churches that stayed, in a sense, racially segregated that have survived, the black churches in our diocese. It's a very surprising thing to learn, at least it was for me, but it helps to explain why there are so few predominantly African American congregations in the Episcopal Church today.
Bishop Marmion was a hero in the racial. There is one episode in the book that does not show him in the best light. I don't know if anybody could have handled it any better. But the black church in Martinsville did not have a priest, and so and there were few black priests to choose from. So he chose a white priest who was a member of the NAACP and was very involved in African American issues, to the point where he had been arrested a couple of times. Well, he wasn't arrested; he was thrown out of a courtroom. He went to a courtroom and sat in the black section with his congregation, and the police told him he had to move, and he didn't want to move. He says, "This is my congregation," and so there's a picture of him kind of being let out of there. But Bishop Marmion said, we're going to have him come 2 days a week to Martinsville for the black church. And Christ Church said, no, you're not. We're not going to. They had no power in this. I mean, the bishop gets, that is absolutely policy. This is not a policy decision. This is absolutely the bishop's. But Bishop Marmion went down to Martinsville, and Martinsville told him that he couldn't put this priest into that church. And he didn't.
What was the reasoning behind the opposition?
The priest was something of a firebrand. He had been, well, I say that may not be fair. He was a man of conviction, is what he was, and he had been in Rocky Mount, and Rocky Mount had passed a resolution to all of their deputies, including the priests, that you could not vote for. They were told that they could not vote for integration, and the priest's name was Jack Teeter. Jack Teeter said, "I'm going to vote my conscience. I don't care what you say." And so he wound up leaving that church, and he bounced around a while. He went to a couple of black churches, and then the bishop asked him to go to Martinsville, and Christ Church, kind of full of themselves, told him, "No, he's not."
Well, and one of the things that's remarkable too is, we've been talking about this kind of secular sacred distinction, but we're talking about a church camp here too. So, I mean, this isn't even something outside of the explicit purview of the church as an institution. Yeah, it's interesting. What are the questions? Yes, Rick.
I just had a historical question, Roy, about Phil Gresham. Who was the rector prior to him? Do you?
Charles Fishburne. Charles Fishburne ran for bishop in the diocese. He was there for 20 years.
Okay.
He was there for 20 years. He ran for bishop. He lost. Wound up in Tryon, North Carolina, which I understand is kind of a Tony church.
Did he retire out of Martinsburg, or did he go on to other parishes after he left?
Fishburne?
Fishburne, yeah.
Fishburne wound up in North Carolina, in Tryon, North Carolina, in a very, from what I understand, a very wealthy church, and did very well by himself. Fishburne, one of the things that Martinsville had a men's club. Lots of churches have men's clubs, right? No big deal. They had Muhlenberg speak. They had Dodd speak. They had there was a whole list. I can't remember all of them. Who was Time Life Fortune magazine? But they had some of the greatest theologians of the 20th century at their men's club. This was a prominent church, a powerful church that Gresham at 29 was in charge of, and
not only was he in charge of at 29, but he followed a 20-year rectorate, right?
Yes, they wanted him so badly. They fell in love with Gresham, the search committee in the vestry. They offered him the exact same package that Fishburne had after being there 20 years. They gave the same package to this young man. So the fact that he only lasted 4 years and they more or less ran him off, it's a remarkable story in itself. Fishburne was very successful. I think he only got like 2 votes in the clergy, and I think that kind of burns a little bit. Thank you, Greg.
Yes.
Roy, could you talk a little bit about the youth group and the role of the kids' life? Because that's a big theme in your book, and it's in the name of it, and you haven't talked as much about it here, but I'm curious.
I apologize because that's what got me interested in the whole thing. And we wanted to talk about the racism issue, but they were the youth loved the rector. They loved Gresham, and Gresham sided with the bishop, and they decided that they were going to raise money to buy the bishop a crozier. Now, this is Low Church, Virginia, so the bishop didn't have a crozier, so they decided Gresham was kind of high church. High Church Episcopal. So he decided that they were going to get a crozier, and they raised money, and it became a peace offering to the bishop, because the bishop was so put upon by the adults in their congregation, and they wanted to show that they weren't going to that they were going to go with their bishop and their priest. At the annual meeting, I mentioned that after 1958, they put together a committee, and that was supposed to go to every church. And the youth got together and said, well, this is about a youth camp. We want to talk to the committee. When they come in, we're going to have a manifesto. Now, manifesto was a buzzword because there was the Southern Manifesto. The Southern Manifesto was absolutely segregationist type thing. So they were going to have a manifesto that says that we don't care. We'll go to camp with blacks or whites or anything. So, but they got Duke Sutton who read it, and one of the lawyers stood up and said, "Well, we really appreciate the fact that you children are involved in this issue, but you should leave this up to adults about things that you just can't understand. And just stick to your schoolwork and let it go." And so the crozier became a peace offering, and they gave it. They wound up giving it to the bishop, and they knew that they were in opposition to their leadership. They were embarrassed by their, most young people are embarrassed by their parents anyway, but I mean, they had a real reason to be embarrassed at this point. It was, and of course they followed Gresham. I'm trying to, there are a whole bunch of stories about the youth, just fun stories about wrestling. They had a wrestling group. Gresham started. The school didn't have a wrestling team. Gresham was a wrestler, so he started a wrestling team, and he got the boys together, and he became they started a wrestling club, I guess until the high school officially. But he would invite the boys over to the rectory, and they'd push all the furniture back, and they would wrestle on the floor of the rectory, which would get either of us thrown out in a New York second.
Well, Roy, thank you so much for your conversation today. Roy is going to be with us through the service and after as well. He's got copies of the book there if you want to learn more about the details of the community and so forth. But let's give Roy a round of applause.